Good morning, buenos dias. Thanks for the introduction, Katie. As you are joining us, here, let's start sharing. As you are seeing our first slide, we ask you to add a word or phrase that comes to mind when seeing this image on the chat. We'll give you a couple minutes, couple seconds to do that. So what comes to mind when you're seeing this picture? And so again, you're looking at this image and you're thinking, what words or what phrases come to mind? Now, add a word or phrase about this picture that is related to equity and justice. I don't know if I can. Oh. Awesome. I'm noticing some reoccurring words. So many powerful words for the monarch to carry, right? Monarchs aren't just beautiful, they're also strong. And so we'll go to the next slide, and you'll see an image that shows some of the words that are actually seen on the chat, but also words that are going to be central to the presentation. Some of you thought of words that identify, like maybe somebody's identity, words that describe, like emotions. I'm also seeing words of processes like ecology, pollination, equity as a process. All these words are words that we're going to touch upon during the presentation. And so as you see and hear some of these words, think about the times that you've heard them associated with monarchs, whenever you've been engaged with monarchs. So next slide. So this brings us to today's presentation. Monarchs are for everyone, ? A deeper look at equity and justice. So first, the goal of this presentation is for participants to gain a better understanding of equitable monarch engagement and gain strategies on how to address equity and justice in any environmental program. Some of the topics we will cover will be on indigenous monarch narratives, cultural whiteness, missing narrative, cultural humility, examples of community-based activities, centering outdoors even when doing virtual programming, and more. Next slide. We will begin by introducing equity and racial justice for community and monarchs, giving examples and equity design. We would hit our midpoint, and then we will talk about cultural humility. If we have time to answer any questions, we will answer them towards the end, and followed by some suggested actions. Next slide. Before I introduce today's presenters and my team, we wanted to share our group acknowledgements. We lean on these group acknowledgements as we went through the process of building out this presentation together. Participants, consider this an invitation to frame how you collaborate with others in this session and beyond. Some of our group acknowledgements were holding accountability between each other, listening and learning, centering BIPOC narratives, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and dismantling and building thoughts, concepts, and assumptions together. And I tell you, that was one of the hard things, was dismantling something that we had built, but it was very important to our presentation. Next slide. Now, I'd like to introduce our team, starting with the voice you've been hearing or the words you've been seeing. That's me, Joel Perez. I'm a proud DACA recipient, aka Dreamer, from Mexico. Like the Beatles like to remind us, I am not the only one. We Dreamers are in every community, and a lot of us are doing important jobs. I'm also an urban conservationist for the Nature Conservancy in Northwest Indiana. My responsibilities and experiences include but are not limited to land conservation, education in nature, event program coordination, and connecting people to nature. Next up, Victor Dufour. Victor Dufour serves as Associate Director of Community. In his current role, he works collaboratively to establish strategic partnerships with local stakeholders that improve access to resources for children, youth, and adult learners in one of Chicago's most ethnically and culturally diverse neighborhoods. And now, from North Park Village Nature Center, Amaris Alanis Ribeiro. Amaris is the Center Director of North Park Village Nature Center in Chicago. She is an award-winning leader in innovative environmental education and equity in museums, botanic gardens, nonprofits, and grassroots movements. Also, from NPVNC, last but not least, Ryan Vance. Ryan Vance is the program specialist of North Park Village Nature Center in Chicago. He is an experienced developer of experimental programming for people of all ages. So you know, our presentation was co-designed by Latinx and white folks. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Victor Dufour, who will lead us through a land acknowledgement and place-based context. Take it away, Victor.
Hey, thanks, Joel. I appreciate the energy that you brought to the introduction, and I just want to start by saying it's really an honor to be a part of Wild Things 2021. This is my first time participating in the engagement, and I'm just happy to be a part of this amazing group of co-presenters and attendees. As representatives of the North Park Village Nature Center, the Nature Conservancy, and the Albany Park Community Center, we acknowledge that the communities that we sit in and organize within sit upon ancestral homelands of the Council of Three Fires, Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, along with dozens of tribes who have cultivated and molded the land and waterways of Chicago prior to European colonization and displacement. We acknowledge that Chicago is currently home to more than 65,000 American Indians, making it the largest urban American Indian community in the nation, the third largest urban American Indian community in the nation, and a community that continues to practice their tribal and intertribal cultures while flourishing and enhancing the beauty of Albany Park, the city of Chicago, and its surrounding regions. We want to give this acknowledgement as part of our collective commitment to center and uplift Indigenous voices, narratives, and communal knowledge of the land and spaces we live and serve today. Next slide, please. So Albany Park is one of 77 distinct community areas of Chicago. Some of you on this call may be familiar with the Albany Park community. The neighborhood is geographically situated on the city's northwest side, where its eastern and northern boundaries are formed by the North Branch of the Chicago River. This is an important waterway that connects the Des Plaines River, which is a tributary of the Illinois and Mississippi rivers, to Lake Michigan. I make a point of noting this when we provide some place-based context of Albany Park and its surrounding water and the role that its surrounding waterways and geography play in the area. They play an important role in American Indian settlement and cultivation of this land. Advanced knowledge of these landscapes, ecosystems, and waterways were used to develop vast networks for trading, portage of boats across the region, and much, much more. Established hundreds of years prior to European settlement and native displacement, these complex networks remain prominent avenues and transportation routes today. Elston Avenue, a major thoroughfare running diagonally through the west side of Albany Park, creates the neighborhood's western boundary and can be seen on the maps above, highlighted in red. In the small red box, this is an area now known as Albany Park. Along the northern boundary of Albany Park, neighborhoods such as Forest Glen and North Park sit on former sites of American Indian settlement. But that doesn't mean that there isn't activity among the American Indian community today. Despite institutional and government-led attempts to remove, disrupt, and relocate American Indian populations, past and present, Albany Park continues to be a site of rich tribal activity, community organizing, and land cultivation. Centers like the American Indian Center, which were founded in 1965, continue to advocate for recognition of Indigenous lands and history. In the picture above, we see various members of the Chi Nation Youth Council at the First Nation Garden, which is a city-owned plot which has been reclaimed and formally recognized by the city as ancestral land. This is a monumental moment in Chicago history, and this is a space that we want to honor. Next slide, please. So Albany Park, for a lot of us, is often recognized as one of the most ethnically and diverse neighborhoods in Chicago. It's got one of the highest percentages of foreign-born residents of any neighborhood in Chicago. And within Albany Park, it's estimated that just over 50,000 residents call it home. Roughly 46% of the neighborhood's population identify as Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx, and 63% of households in Albany Park speak another language other than English, which is a tremendous statistic to include. While large numbers of foreign-born residents from across the world call Albany Park home, the overwhelming majority are from Central America and Latin America, with high representation from Guatemala, Ecuador, and Mexico. Within the Mexican and Mexican-American community of Albany Park, many families have connection to the southern state of Michoacan. The name Michoacan is a close derivative of the Nahua place name, Mitoacan, which is roughly translated as the land of the fishermen. But it's also the home of the Purepecha people, an indigenous group to the region who hold deep ancestral knowledge and appreciation of the land and its relationship to the monarch butterfly. As you walk, drive, or commute through Albany Park, it's easy to overlook the neighborhood's deep connection to Michoacan. But if you slow down, you'll see many of the reoccurring images, business names, and murals that represent Michoacan's place in Chicago and in Albany Park. Take a look at the colorful mural on the wall of a local storage facility, which dawns an image of the popular transit line that many Albany Park residents commute on daily. Just above it, we see the image of a monarch taking flight, escaping the hand of a captor, or maybe it's a cultivator. In local sporting goods shops, you may see the familiar red and gold of Las Monarcas de Morelia, a popular football team from Michoacan's capital. And at local ice cream shops, you find paletas with an illustration of a young woman spawning her very own wings. As we encounter these images, we must ask ourselves, what significance do these displays of cultural symbolism hold? And further than that, what are the missing narratives that lie behind these images of the monarch and of Michoacan? Just a few blocks north of these busy commercial corridors, the Albany Park Community Center empowers our community by providing a diverse range of programs and services that help educate, support, and transform the lives of children, youth, and adults. We've done this for more than 45 years, and we've become known as one of the largest social service providers serving the northwest side of Chicago. We have a history of predominantly serving refugees, newly arrived immigrants, and low-income residents from the community. Our early childhood education and after-school youth programs are among the largest in the community, and we serve more than 200 children and youth daily. For working families in the area, this is an essential program, and it's much more than childcare. APCC's programs place a high emphasis on developing and delivering culturally competent and linguistically informed teaching strategies that meet the unique needs of each child and family in our neighborhood. We place a heavy emphasis on the social, emotional, and cognitive development of these children through play, hands-on project-based investigations, and youth voice and choice. Parents and relatives of children at the center take advantage of a robust list of programming options for adults, which include adult education courses like citizenship preparation, English as a second language, GED, bilingual mental health services, and workforce development and training programs. Access to these programs and the organization's holistic approach to family service are critical in generating opportunity and upward mobility for many members of our community. But more than that, we create a space for these community members and narratives to thrive. As the pandemic closed the world and the city of Chicago down in early 2020, our organization pivoted to deliver all of our programming online. And as the city reopened, we were eager to reopen our doors to the many working families and essential workers that rely on our child care programming on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So in August of 2020, more than 150 youth who were enrolled in APCC's childcare programs and youth programming prepared to return to remote learning at Chicago Public Schools. This was daunting, it made us nervous, and there was real concern about the safety of these children. Our program staff, directors, and agency leadership engaged closely with our Parent Policy Committee, a group made up of many, many parents at the center who help make decisions on programming, hiring, and more at the center. We wanted to hear the voices and the needs of families we serve as we went into this monumental moment in human history. Collectively, we developed a survey that translated into more than 10 languages spoken among families at the center. And through close dialogue, we learned that parents at APCC had deep concerns about the upcoming school year. Among those concerns were limited access to internet, learning devices, the cost of school supplies, and access to the training that they needed to support their child's online learning and prioritize mental health and wellness. With this knowledge, we prepared the best we could to provide the support families needed. As a delegate agency of the Chicago Connected Initiative, we called more than 8,000 homes in Albany Park to make sure they were connected to the internet. And at our center alone, we connected close to 50 families in our programs to internet. We ensured that families in need of learning devices were able to communicate with CPS and receive the devices they needed for free. And we held several webinars for parents, helping them understand learning portals, communication tools, and ways to promote positive learning outcomes at home. Lastly, we shifted an annual backpack drive that we hold every year outdoors to protect the safety and well-being of community members in need of essential supplies. At this engagement, we provided book bags and much-needed supplies for home learning, but we also partnered with local health agencies to provide resources on COVID symptoms and safety, local testing facilities, and ways to practice wellness. At the backpack drive, our partners at the North Park Village Nature Center provided general information on the monarch and handed out items such as nature journals, magnification tools, t-shirts, milkweed plants, and seed packets that were locally harvested. While these were not essential items, they were items that had a connection to wellness, outdoors, and stewardship in connection with our local ecology. This was an important moment in APCC's partnership with the North Park Village Nature Center, and a seed that has germinated and grown the conversation we're having today about deeper program design with a lens on racial justice and equity. Next slide. This is a photo of some of the milkweed plants that were left at the center after the engagement. In the photo, you'll see one of the youth from the center working to plant some of the milkweed plants that were left. These photos carry a lot of significance for me personally, but also for the center. APCC has a small green space outdoors that has often been underutilized. And there's been times when we haven't necessarily known how to best engage community members and clients with it. But in the first week of our full-day e-learning program, as students returned back to school, the milkweed plants that were left by the North Park Village Nature Center and another ecological restoration group in the community, we planted these milkweed plants with youth and staff. And it was really well received. And I think this really nurtured a real need and an expressed need to disconnect from the world of virtual engagement and learning. And throughout the pandemic, we've seen our center's small green space, which is filled with native pollinators, receive a lot more attention and activity than it typically has among our childcare classrooms community members that are passing by, and staff that have utilized it as a space for reprieve, learning, and recreation. Next slide, please. And Amaris, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Victor. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias, bom dia. As I listen to Victor and I transition into introducing North Park Village Nature Center, I think about the many things that Victor mentioned in regards to the land acknowledgement and the demographics of Albany Park, for which we are just 1 mile away. When you Google North Park Village Nature Center, you find many images of nature, which is beautiful and great. Lots of greenery, lots of grass, a cottage-looking building that's behind the trees. And I guess for some, that might be a little bit scary. It makes me think of Hansel and Gretel, a cottage like that. Or maybe it might be also something that is just not for me. As institutions, we often think that we are open for all to use, that there isn't one narrative that is being promoted. But running business as usual, there is a narrative. Take the picture on the upper left. It references Per Peterson, a Norwegian nurseryman who bought the land that the nature preserve sits on today and whose trees are still thriving at the preserve. But when we talk about thanking Per Peterson for his trees, we are erasing the native history of the land. Take the picture on the lower left. As environmentalists, you all probably recognize that as one of Audubon's work. A few years back, as a staff, we had a discussion about this painting in the interior of the center. One staff wanted to replace it with something else, and another staff felt strongly that it belonged at the Nature Center. Who can question Audubon? But it's interesting that the conservation organizations today are having similar conversations about unpacking these different environmentalists. For example, Audubon as a multiracial person or Audubon as a slave owner. When we say we are community-based, we have to ask ourselves which communities and why. Our past Monarch festivals, for example, like Monarch Palooza pictured here, were smaller festivals, a niche group of people, and not necessarily culturally relevant to Michoacan. And as a center director, I believe it's the responsibility to unpack some of these narratives and work through them. Next. So to rethink business as usual, I think it's important to identify the communities we would like to co-create with. Is it okay to be explicit about which communities? Absolutely, yes. You have to identify specific demographics so that you can be able to track that impact. And what we found helpful in this process of planning a new and edited versions of Monarch Palooza was talking with other partners who do monarch conservation in various communities of Chicago. We talked with Mike Rizzo, a longtime partner and friend who has been doing monarch community work for years. We talked with other Chicago Park District colleagues, for example, at Dvorak Park, and programmers at the El Paseo Community Garden in the Pilsen community of Chicago, which is predominantly Mexican community. When talking with them, we learned many things, like what type of outreach activity would make sense for Dvorak Park. We also learned that El Paseo is a true asset in the community and a leader in monarch conservation in their own way and right. In fact, it was our role to step back and amplify their work. They didn't need us. The same notion of listening and learning we practice with partners, we also strive to do so internally. And so I work closely with my colleague, Ryan, who I'm so happy to be co-presenting with you today, because there was a lot of work of internal thinking through monarchs and racial equity. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Amaris, for framing how we began to develop Monarch content with a lens on community, voice, and equity. Like most organizations did in 2020, we added virtual content in response to the state's safety precautions. At the Nature Center, Monarch Palooza was typically a one-day in-person festival that celebrated the beginning of the monarch butterfly's fall migration. 2020 was also the 10-year anniversary of hosting this festival. So we decided to create programming that spanned 2 weeks. This time frame was chosen to increase the space dedicated to meaningful and equitable impact around the themes of uplifting Indigenous culture, community engagement, and justice for the monarch. At the Nature Center, we talked about what responsive virtual engagement meant to us. The Monarch Palooza virtual event was primarily on Facebook, so we designed one post per day for 2 weeks. This was a balance between creating our own content and uplifting the content of others. One example of uplifting other content was sharing direct stories from Michoacan. We did this by sharing a film trailer for the Counting Wings documentary series. This part was called Faina, the third installment of the series, which aimed to start a conversation about how we do research, tell stories about science, and think about conservation. Beyond this content, we were thoughtful about sharing other organizations' monarch engagement, such as the East Chicago Monarch Festival, which Joelle will speak to later. You can find all of our content archived on the Nature Center's Facebook page. At the end of this presentation, I'll be copying some links into the chat for us to use. So as we mapped out our virtual schedule of content, we were aware from conversations in the community that not everyone had a device to view this content online, or access to the internet, or used Facebook. So in response, we also want to prioritize other formats beyond virtual, such as community outreach, which Victor spoke to earlier, as well as trailside engagement. And I'll share more about that now. Throughout the pandemic, the Nature Center stayed open to provide the public with brief respites in nature. Since the preserve was open for visitors, we recognized that this was a direct pathway for engagement. At the Nature Center, passive engagement and on-site engagement means that we would connect with visitors through thoughtfully designed imagery as they traveled through the trails of the preserve. This would hit 2 benefits. Visitors engaged with content around monarchs and other narratives, while also receiving the health benefits of being outdoors. The first example of this engagement includes our very important pollinator garden, or VIP garden. Located in front of the Nature Center, the VIP garden hosted a variety of native wildflowers surrounded by a 10-foot tall fence. The fence was built to keep the local deer from eating the plants. The VIP garden began in 2016 and was made possible through a grant provided by the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation, Chicago Park District funds, raised beds built by the City of Chicago's Green Corps program, and support by staff and volunteers of North Park Village Nature Center. So through thoughtful volunteer work, a series of photos and facts about native pollinators and nectar sources that were living within the pollinator garden was posted to the fence. You can see this in the lower left corner of this slide. This allowed us to uplift the importance of all pollinators, not just monarchs. Along with pollinators, the images provided info about the late blooming nectar sources, which were critical for monarchs during their 2,000-mile migration. There was additional meaning behind the photographs and information being placed on the fencing. This symbolized nature across borders, as the monarch is often a symbol for immigration reform and DACA students, or dreamers. We also featured art within the pollinator garden. Hanging from the pergola was a sculpture that connected visitors with the awe-inspiring phenomena of monarch roosting. Monarchs hung from the pergola and appeared to be roosting just as they do at night as they migrate south, and also as they rest in oyamel fir trees in the mountaintops of Michoacan. The sculpture was made by visitors who participated in the very first Monarch Palooza Festival in 2010, and that can be seen in the lower right corner. Another example highlighted monarchs through art and expression. Posted on the fencing that surrounded the Savannah Restoration Project within the preserve was art contributed by Girl Scouts. Using upcycled pillowcases and a technique called crayon batik, Girl Scouts dyed fabric, melted crayon wax, and created art. This can be seen in the upper right corner. Now I'd like to share a little bit more about a different format for our programming, which was amplifying the Indigenous Michoacan narrative within our programming. Throughout our engagement, it was important for us to include music and art that uplifted the Michoacan community's cultural and scientific knowledge about the monarch. We literally included this statement throughout the virtual content that we shared. It was important for the content not just be a section within our engagement. It needed to be weaved throughout. As opposed to multiculturalism, this was uplifting a specific culture. This was one way to think about the differences between inclusion versus equity. Inclusion can be an afterthought. Like you've done the work once and then move on. We wanted to demonstrate uplifting the message throughout. So on 3 days of our 2-week post, we featured the Chicago-based band Son Monarcas. The monarch has several symbolic meanings, one of which is the harvest butterfly, celebrating the harvest of corn. And so our partners, Son Monarcas, shared these stories with us via music and dance. Here is a video from Son Monarcas' performance at the 2019 Monarch Palooza Festival, Danza de los Viejitos, Dance of the Old Men, which is a traditional folk dance in Michoacan. This dance was danced by the Purepecha people by 4 men representing components of the cosmos: fire, water, earth, air. The number 4 also represents the 4 colors of corn: red, yellow, white, blue. The 4 seasons and the 4 directions: north, south, east, and west. So I'm going to share about 30 seconds of this video for you. And that is one example of how we amplified the Indigenous narrative. Now I'll turn it back to Amaris, who will explore deeper impacts of addressing racial equity within the local Albany Park community.
I wanted to share with you all that actually my familia is from Michoacan. So I grew up witnessing El Baile del Viejito and monarchs as a child and throughout my life. Chicago is home to over 250,000 immigrants of Michoacan. My mom is from a small rural farm town called Irimbo, and my dad from Ciudad Hidalgo, not far from the overwintering site. In Chicago, we often say that there are more people from Ciudad Hidalgo in Michoacan than in Ciudad Hidalgo. And as Victor mentioned earlier, with the symbolism, the cultural connection of the monarch is carried with folks as they migrate from Michoacan to Chicago, and can be noticed throughout the businesses, as we mentioned earlier, with the word Michoacan, Morelia, the capital of Michoacan, or Monarca, the Spanish word for monarch. In considering outreach, I kept holding on to the idea that as an institution, I don't want to come to the community and tell them all about monarchs and what they should do. I wanted to uplift the monarch knowledge beyond symbolism. I wanted to illuminate the knowledge, the narrative, and connections that exist. I thought deeply about how Michoacan businesses are so critical to the community in many ways. These businesses are places of cultural preservation, places for economic prosperity for communities. As you are aware, the pandemic is having a large impact on BIPOC-owned small businesses. The idea of an initiative to support Michoacan businesses came to mind. We collaborated with a local artist to co-design a poster that reflected the many connections of the monarch, the indigenous symbolism of corn and food, and the connection from Michoacan to Albany Park. The Support Local Michoacan Businesses initiative invited residents of the area to support Michoacan businesses in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. We created a list of businesses and asked others to add to the list. The list included taquerias, supermarkets, and ice cream shops, to name a few. Ryan and I internally had a lot of conversations about this. Is this the work to do at a nature center? Our partner, for example, said things like, this is out of the box. So I would like to ask you, what does it mean for you to do racial equity work? Next. So some organizations engage audience with monarchs via citizen science. Some organizations have now renamed it to community science. Well, at the Nature Center, we really began to explore this notion and look beyond it. In the past, we engaged summer camp participants and visitors in raising monarchs. We began to ask ourselves several questions. Is it a goal for households to raise monarchs? What is the latest science around this? What are the ethical implications? And what are the practices beyond science with connecting with monarchs? We explored the various community science activities that exist. And rather than attempt to a model of inclusion to the field of science, we focused again on the Michoacan community as a holder of traditional ecological knowledge about monarchs. We challenge you to try to uplift existing indigenous science within communities without the knowledge being delivered from an organization to a community. This can be done through stewardship of self and land and connections to the systems we are a part of. This is also an opportunity to rethink how we do research and tell stories about science. Are we amplifying Western science, or are we recognizing that science is cultural? Create family and community-based activities that center knowledge being exchanged intergenerationally, really uplift by the keepers of that science. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Ryan. No, actually, no. I turns it back to Joel.
Thank you, Maris. Hey everyone again. So I will be going into some of the thought process behind the East Chicago Festival de la Monarcas. Some of you might immediately think of the east side of Chicago, because I get that a lot. Every time I talk about, I'm from East Chicago, and every time I talk about where I'm from, people always think I'm from the east side. Well, East Chicago is actually a city in Indiana. Very few people know that. And so I wanted to show you guys a map on the left side in relations to Chicago, where that was, just southeast of Chicago along Lake Michigan. It is also an area often referred to as the region, if you've heard of that term before. It's like if you're from this area, you're usually not Hoosier enough to be accepted by Indiana and not Chicagoan enough to be accepted by Chicago. We go through this a lot. And so I also wanted to show you a map from the book of the Potawatomi Indians by Otto Winger and acknowledge what this region might have looked like before settlement. It's when I first looked at this map, it really sort of took me back you know, to imagine what this place looked like. I currently work in natural areas of dune and swale, and it's amazing to even think of what that would look like if it was expansive throughout the region. Next slide. Before I continue, I wanted to share the reasons I wanted to organize a Monarch Festival and what first steps, and how one of the first steps was choosing a place. It all started when I attended my first Monarch Festival. Long story short, because I could talk about it all day, but it felt really short of my expectations. I noticed that there was a lot of missing narratives, that the festival seemed to only engage a group of similar people. Like a monoculture to me of vegetation, it felt like it was missing some diversity. I took it on and to gather a group of partners to design our own festival. I reached out to some of the local conservation groups that helped me with this festival. And so when I say we, I'm talking about our partners like the Field Museum, Audubon Great Lakes, Save the Dunes, Shirley Hines Land Trust to start. We chose East Chicago. We wanted to center it around the Michoacan community. And we chose East Chicago because of its central location, not to the region, but just to the history of the Mexican community. Next slide. When some people think of East Chicago, they think of this industrial city. It is pretty heavy on industry. And its industry its industry is the reason why it has such a diverse demographic. A little short history. During the early 1900s, there's a shortage of workforce in the steel mills due to the U.S. involvement in World War I. Sorry about that. Just dropped my phone. This shortage led to a wave of Mexican immigrants to the area. A lot of them from the central states of Mexico, like Michoacan. A lot of them stayed and made the region their home. So it made sense to us to center the festival in East Chicago and try to uplift those communities. We also considered that Northwest Indiana was an important stopover to the monarchs as they are migrating to the overwintering sites in Mexico. On the picture on the right is a rare habitat that I spoke of that exists here known as dune and swale. During the time that the monarchs are migrating through, the water levels usually drop and expose fields of nectarine sources for them. When I took this picture, there was probably hundreds of monarchs re-energizing for their long journeys. You can't really see it in this picture because they're kind of fluttering all about. Another thing I want to acknowledge was that it was also known that the community of East Chicago was not really connected with the natural areas that surrounded them, even though they were just a couple miles away. We wanted to also keep in mind the importance of doing monarch justice at the festival. So this is something that we were thinking about. Next slide. It didn't take much to notice through the businesses that with references to the state of Michoacan, that Michoacan was truly present here in the Chicago community, including this great mural found at El Gran Taco. If you guys been to Chicago, it's not easy. It's not hard to miss on Indianapolis Boulevard, with painted monarchs all over it. Now, I will admit that I've lived a really long time in Chicago, most of my life, and at first, I'd never noticed the monarchs. It wasn't until I started doing monarch engagement and started learning about the monarchs that I noticed all these things. And it has been there since I can remember. Sometimes it's as easy as driving around, commuting in the neighborhood, and paying attention to really know who is in the community. We tend to overlook that sometimes. So as we started to design the festival, we also acknowledged the lack of green spaces, as I mentioned before, and accessibility to the natural areas that the community had. Instead of sort of expecting the communities to come to our nature preserves, we decided to go to the community. And so it was another reason why we wanted to have this festival within the community. We wanted to sort of meet them where they were at their own doorsteps. We really wanted to focus on the community aspect of it. We wanted the festival to be how the community sort of envisioned it. We wanted to have a say on what this festival would look like. We invited and talked to local organizations and invited them to the table. We added partners such as the Latinx Club from the Ivy Tech community here in East Chicago. We wanted to listen and seek out feedback from the community that would hopefully help improve following festivals. We also wanted to make sure we were engaging people of all ages. We looked at other possible inequities and tried to address them as best as we could. We didn't want to place a financial burden on the communities, so we found ways of making sure the festival was free, and also that we were giving away free native plants, including milkweeds and late blooming nectarine sources. We understood that sometimes it was difficult for people to acquire such things. Next slide. To serve justice to the monarch, the plants we gave away, as I mentioned, made sure it was late blooming plants because we knew how important it was for their migration and their really long journey. Given that a lot of families had a preference of speaking Spanish at home, according to the census, we tried to make everything bilingual, make all our data, marketing, advertisement bilingual to the community. We also sent out postcards specifically for the Chicago community, letting them know of this festival, including putting posters up at really popular Mexican restaurants. We try to make sure also to uplift the community by acquiring local vendors, cultural performers, dancers, and musicians. We try to hire within the community. Next slide. And of course, just as the ball was rolling, the pandemic threw us a curveball at us. We had to quickly turn something that was in person and that seemed to be going great and seemed to be really being loved by the community and embraced by the community, including the picture that you saw on the last slide. This would have been the third year in-person festival, and the city of East Chicago, which was also a partner, already had sculptures of monarch butterflies throughout some of its parks that they incorporated after the festival. And so we quickly had to turn something else in person, like I said, to virtual engagement. We try to stay true to our intentions and think of some of the thought process that we had thought of since the beginning. We try to build from our momentum. And like probably most organizers, we were a little bummed that we had to cancel it. I'm not going to lie, but we were able to still uplift even more voices that we didn't think we would have the chance otherwise. Our virtual festivals was a success. One of the things that I was really shocked the most about it was that we were able to engage from people from 28 different states. It was super shocking when I found out, and definitely did not think about it as I was presenting during this festival. We still wanted to center it around East Chicago, so we created activities to continue that engage the community of East Chicago. We had window art contest, and we gave East Chicago residents free art supplies to encourage them to participate. Given the stress that families were experiencing with a lot of screen time, we acknowledged that a lot of things were being done through Zoom. And so we didn't want a festival that was just virtually through Zoom. We wanted to make sure we had a way of engaging them. So maybe something like a hands-on activity that they can work on as a family. And so the window art contest was a perfect thing to do for families to participate. We also figured out a way to give away native plants safely by partnering up with the city of East Chicago's greenhouse. They had a drive-in where people would collect food, and so we were giving out information on milkweeds and nectarine sources in the monarch, as well with the native plants. So we wanted to continue those efforts. We knew the pandemic was also putting stress on our communities in many other different ways. And so with our limited capacity, we installed community guardians with volunteers, bringing nature to them. Again, acknowledging the importance of in such a time we are experiencing for communities to still go outdoors and be connected to nature. And at the same time, putting more stems on the ground for the monarchs and other pollinators, and helping continue pushing those efforts. I like to say that it was a week-long festival, and I don't know how Ryan and Mari's, how you guys did a 2-week, but a week long was a lot of work. But it allowed us to cover many topics, including knowledge on native pollinators and local conservations, and how people can continue to support those efforts. With a virtual platform, can you hit next? Sorry. With a virtual platform, we were able to pay and uplift voices like seen here, Maria de la Marquez, and her 2 daughters from the Purepecha indigenous people. They were able to share their story, their culture with us. Also, voices like Maria Eugenia Gonzalez, a conservationist, educator, and monarch champion for Mexico, giving us different perspectives on monarch conservation and challenges from across the border. It is very valuable to hear the narratives directly from the people instead of us trying to tell it for them. And we were able to do that virtually. We were able to connect with them and present that to the community because of the virtual engagement. We were kind of forced to do, but it was almost like a blessing in disguise. Now, I'd like to say also that one big takeaway we had last year, it feels like forever, but a couple of months ago, was the realization, as mentioned before, that not everybody has access to a computer or smartphone or the internet. We acknowledge that our engagement with our community wasn't as good as maybe we had hoped for, as we wanted. Because of this realization and gathering feedback from the community, we decided to look into how to make it better. And the city got back to us, letting us know that actually a lot of people still watch TV and still use cable. I don't watch TV, so it was news to me. But there are a lot of people watch cable, so we're looking into ways of providing content through our local cable channels and seeing if we can partner up with some of the media, local media. I want to express that each community is different, and sometimes it's a process of learning, listening, but just continue to try to be more equitable and continue learning from that. And like I said, we wanted to make this festival as community oriented as we could. And so we want to continue engaging the community and learning from the community, because this festival is for the community. And so with that, I'd like to pass it on to our next presenter.
Hey, thanks, Joel, for sharing that. I want to take this moment now as we exit this sort of stage of our presentation, which is predominantly focused on the different ways that we've woven in equity and justice work into our engagements. But I want us to take a moment here to pause. And as you look at this photo, which may seem silly, we really need to take a moment to proceed with caution. For many of us on this call, it's probably been easy for us to broadly celebrate and appreciate the many ways that indigenous narratives, cultural customs, scientific knowledge, and cultural diversity and inclusion have been uplifted and woven into the engagements. But there's a real need for deeper reflection, and there's a need for deeper work. It's not enough to simply appreciate and improve access to social services, community-based programming, or monarch engagement. It's not enough to just translate materials, meet community where they're at, or include culturally relevant components into the programming. They're great steps, but it's just that. It's a good start. Yes, we should reduce linguistic and transportation barriers to entry and access, and all of the things that we mentioned, but we've got to do more. There's a much deeper work that needs to be done, specifically among white folks like myself, who sit in positions of power and privilege within our society, organizations, and institutions. To truly advance BIPOC voice and racial equity work, we must move the needle further and develop true cultural humility. When we commit to this work, we move away from moderation and towards distinct anti-racist action. We become stronger allies to BIPOC people, communities, and their priorities. So we need to do this, we need to begin by acknowledging our positions of privilege and power, committing to lifelong learning and self-reflection with a very heavy emphasis on self. For myself and other white folks like me, we have to emphasize self. This is a journey that we must go on and educate ourselves. It is not culturally responsible to ask others to do that work for us. And lastly, we need to work to develop institutional accountability to expand and go further. Next slide, please, Ryan. Let's take a moment to look at this photo. When we look at this photo, what do we see? At first glance, and I hope the rest of us, see a monarch in a vulnerable position, struggling for life. The blue jay sits perched upon a branch with a tight and uncompromising grip on the monarch. Its wings are pierced tightly in its beak. Often known for its bullish and aggressive tendencies, the blue jay appears to think very little of the position of privilege and power it can so easily assert over the monarch. Without hesitation, the blue jay silences and devours its counterpart. Minutes later, in the photo to the right, we observe a much different scene. The predator finds itself in a complete juxtaposition, hunched over, desperate, and what looks like it may be suffering from illness. Although both find themselves in a potentially lethal situation, only the monarch perishes. Filled with pain and illness, the blue jay lives on, but lives with a valuable lesson, and a lesson that we cannot ignore. How does it feel to look at this image of the monarch devoured? How do we respond to the erasure of its beauty, knowing the monarch will no longer be able to contribute to the health of its ecosystem, feed on nectar, or pollinate its favorite wildflowers? As we make the personal commitment to develop deeper cultural humility, we must learn from the blue jay. We remind ourselves that there is serious consequence when our personal power and privilege goes unchecked. We cause irreversible harm to those around us in ways that we can't imagine. When we honor, value, and center BIPOC voice, narrative, and priorities, we begin to forfeit our privilege, and we help shift power in a more equitable direction. So before I go to the next slide, I also just want to acknowledge, as a group, when coming up with this slide, we acknowledged whiteness and the need for collective shifting of power through the personification and metaphor of the monarch and blue jay. But we also recognize that this approach does not fully explore the unpacking of racial equity and justice. And we also acknowledge that this personification can be damaging in some ways to indigenous connection and views of nature. Next slide, Ryan.
Victor, thank you for sharing that metaphor of the power imbalance that whiteness can perpetuate and how we must recognize the shifting power because no culture is better than another. So we're going to talk about lifelong learning, self-reflection, and feeling these moments of discomfort. Beyond recognizing the power shift, it is necessary to begin this journey of learning and unlearning. With that, I'd like to briefly share my personal journey of self-reflection and identifying my own blinders. As a gay white male, I have to acknowledge that I was part of a dominant narrative that used privilege as a form of power and erasure over other narratives. I relied on performativity to appear woke, but lacked the experience of doing real equity work. When I began to co-develop Monarch programming with Amaris, I had no idea about the deeper cultural connections between monarchs, people, and place. Together, Amaris and I, internally at the Nature Center, there were moments of discomfort, and they were necessary to for me to push my needle forward. So when I began to co-develop the, so as a first step, I should say, was to acknowledge where I was at and what my journey and what I was bringing into the program development. Quite often, the programming I developed didn't uplift other narratives. Instead, it was my own personal narrative that I continued to uplift. my experiences, my stories. Later, a stronger shift came in the form of awareness around my own fragility and when I experienced discomfort. Specifically, I was aware of my fragility against conflict. One simple example was when I was pushed to consider how to do deep, equitable work, and I didn't have the right answers, or I said something unintentionally harmful, or I didn't say anything at all. This was my fragility showing. I also suffered from the fragility against making bold statements about my intentions. My fragility was beginning to unravel, thanks to the self-reflection of allies like Amaris, who continued to push me. The part of me that I am now most aware of is that I have to continue to show up daily. Beyond self-reflection, we as a group maintained a sense of accountability in the content that we created for this presentation. An example of this accountability was that we initially wanted to visualize a way for you, the viewer, to identify inequities and design programming that would uplift missing narratives. This would be a tool or a framework for you to do the deeper work. But the truth is that this is your own unique journey to take. While developing this presentation, part of the working group, to be honest, Victor and I built a visualization to help define how to design equitable program development. And while it was useful for framing considerations for program design, we realized as a group, including Joelle and Amaris, that it could be more harmful and even damaging to include that diagram. It does not do justice to oversimplify or prescribe definitions of true equity work. There is not a one-size-fits-all formula, and it doesn't have an easily defined visual. We used accountability within our group to build ideas, then break them down and rebuild new ones together. Much of this work comes from the lived experiences, conversations, and oftentimes struggles that we went through together. So we wanted to promote a solid understanding of what was causing these inequities and identify the inequities and change the system that perpetuates. We asked ourselves in institutions what we could do beyond moving with self-reflection. And we realized it was beyond self-reflection, it was applying that to the institution and to the work you work in. And then above it, beyond within your institution to other aspects of it. And then also to the other institutions we are working with, to use that accountability and to spread that. And so now I'll be handing it back over to Amaris. Thank you.
So where do we go now as institutions working on monarch conservation and engagement? We must begin by understanding the history of conservation as a response to environmental degradation caused as a result of settler colonialism. That same history that has caused the erasure of indigenous narratives, traditional ecological knowledge, and a mutualistic connection with nature. We must unpack that the extraction of resources, exploitation, capitalism, and the mass agricultural system that has removed milkweed, late blooming nectar sources, and caused the appropriation of guacamole to guac for Super Bowls. The monarch is not a token for our narrow ideologies of stewardship. When we consider the beauty, peace, and joy of the monarch, as we listed at the start of the presentation, we must frame our connection to the monarch as a beyond the human, deserving of justice. Next. Next slide.
Is it there?
Yep. I also want to talk about that while the monarch spans connections across countries with its unique annual migration journey, we should recognize that the notion of iconic species in the broader work for native pollinators is critical to support and uplift pollinators such as species of concern, such as the rusty patch bumblebee, the regal fritterly, swall metalmark, just to name a few. At North Park Village Nature Center, we made a decision that as an ecological restoration natural area, we would not keep honeybees anymore. Many visitors, staff, and volunteers were concerned about the experience that live honeybees meant for their visit and engagement. However, not many visitors were aware of the harm caused by human agricultural practices of the introduction of mass amount of honeybees from Europe. European honeybees compete for the same resources as some of the local pollinators and further cause an imbalance in the ecosystem. In response, the Nature Center is intentionally creating opportunities to educate visitors on the many pollinators of the area. As mentioned earlier, we have pop-up signage on our pollinator garden, and we also shared a pollinator garden video created by our land manager, shared during the Monarch Palooza Festival. Next. As environmentalists and educators, we are aware how everything in our ecosystem is interdependent. As institutions, we need to be accountable for our decisions, actions, and oftentimes lack of action in regards to social and environmental justice efforts. When considering the monarch, do we consider migration and DACA students? When considering restoration plans, do we support the restoration of native passageways, such as the coil mound pictured here? Monarchs in all species need clean air and water. Have you signed the petition to stop the general iron permit, supported by the hunger strikers, and reached out to local officials? Beyond the work in the Midwest, how are we supporting the work in Mexico, where the monarch roosts during winter? Since justice is intersectional and racism is systemic, environmental work calls for intersectional and systemic actions. Thank you all for being with us this morning.
So thank you, Amaris, for sharing that. Now we'd like to take a pause from presenting and uplift any participants' questions. And so I'm going to minimize the screen here to see if I can see any questions here. I see that Kyla Klein thanks us for bringing up the general iron environmental racism. And I see Kathleen Garnis lists that there are almost 500 species of native bees in our region.
Brian, there was one question in the chat, and I'll open this up to our working group if this is a question that we feel appropriate to respond to. But it says, in your presentation, in your preparation for this presentation, what was the discussion about presenting in both English and Spanish? And I'm not sure if that question is asking how we considered preparing for this presentation in English and Spanish, or generally in our monarch engagement. So whoever left that question, if you want to make that clarification in the chat. And I'll also ask our working group, is that something that we feel, is that a question that we feel comfortable responding to?
Yes.
Yeah, I was curious if sharing meant within the festival and also this presentation.
And maybe we can speak to both points. I will say, and I'll step forward here on this one. I will say, in through the lens of preparing for this presentation, we as a group really tried to think intentionally about kind of what the dominant narrative is, and as best as possible, we tried to prepare ourselves to prepare our presentation for the audience that Amaris and Ryan and Joelle have seen at the Wild Things engagements in the past. So I will say we did not prioritize delivering this content for the purposes of this presentation in Spanish, and maybe there's an opportunity for that in the future. And I'd love to hear from Wild Things after this about their efforts to engage non-English speaking populations in Wild Things. Is there anybody else that would like to speak to the point of preparing presentation or material for the general public or communities we work within?
Yes, I would like to definitely talk about this. I know Ryan and I, for programming and experiences, we've talked about that. But what I want to focus is on during the presentation. We considered, at least myself, past Wild Things presentations and who the potential audience would be. A lot of this racial equity work, if you notice in the later part of the presentation, we said the work that needs to be done by folks who are not BIPOC. So considering that, we did have a target audience in mind. I always say cultural relevancy, the Spanish language, for example, eso es para nosotros. But this presentation had a clear target in mind. All that said, the accessibility of all presentations and when communicating science is deeply important to me. Allied Media is a great resource about accessibility, as well as the Inclusive Science Communication Conference. But again, in the right time and moment, and done well, not just by being accessible, by ensuring the participation is there to receive those services.
Ryan, it looks like there's a couple other questions that have come in, and I'm sure that there's also, we're acknowledging that there's probably a lot that we're missing in the chat as things are coming in, but are there any there that you see that you'd like to pick out? And Amaris and Joelle, as you guys look at the chat, let me know or let us know if there's questions that you'd like to pull out.
I do see a question from Tom. Does Michoacan have a monarch roost like El Rosario? Would anyone in our group feel comfortable addressing that? I don't know what El Rosario is. El
Rosario is one of the sanctuaries where monarchs roost. So that would be an example. And there are also smaller pockets. I have, various families who live in that area where they're not nature preserves, but there's a smaller pocket of the monarchs roosting. But El Rosario it would be one.
There's another question here that I think is probably pretty central to the presentation. It says, this is from Kyla Klein. What have you learned about monarchs through your engagement with immigrants from Michoacan? So what have we in our engagement learned in this process?
For me, I think what I learned was that the idea of resources being available at events that we have for people beyond binoculars or maps. This means resources that could help families, resources that, maybe connect to healthcare, connect to education, community, to uplift them. So beyond just outdoor tools and more to life resources.
And I wonder if this question, what it's getting at is, what are some of the moments that we've had as we've engaged with community members with connection to Michoacan? What is some knowledge that we've learned from community members specifically about the monarch?
I don't know about specifically about the monarch, but I just wanted to mention, something that I've learned, engaging with the community, especially of the community of Michoacan, is, it goes back to sort of like those missing narratives. Even me as myself, I love soccer, football, and Monarcas Morelia. I mean, that's a team that I grew up with, but never did I realize that, the team it's about monarchs. I mean, even in the team's logo, there's it depicts a monarch. And so just talking with the community, I mean, like, kind of the connection is there. The connection to the monarchs is there, and you can see it through like businesses and everything. And it's just a lack that we're not uplifting those voices. There's so many narratives out there that are missing, that we're not that we don't know about, that we think don't exist, but they exist. They exist with those communities. So it's just to me, it's just going to those communities and asking them like, hey, you're from Michoacan, like, what do you know about like the monarchs? And them telling us like like just hearing stories, how they're connected to the monarchs. Like, so you knew about the monarchs, like, like it's that's always been there. It's just just kind of been overlooked. So that's why like I feel pretty proud of trying to uplift those voices that maybe we would have never heard of if nobody's asking.
And I'll say one of the things that I think I learned early on, or we as a group talked about early on in preparing this presentation, was the responsibility that we have in communities that we work within to not assume certain knowledge and connection, right? I mean, I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, for example, and just because I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, doesn't mean that I know everything about the Indy 500 and race cars and apparatuses, right? So, we also have to acknowledge as a group that it's not fair to make the assumption that just because someone has a connection to Michoacan or Mexico, that they have a certain knowledge of the monarch. So, we have to be careful about that, I think, as well. And that's something that we talked about a bit.
I'll just add one more note. The Purepecha is one example of one community in Michoacan. Where my mom is from would be the Tarasco community, and narratives are complex. The Day of the Dead is often brought up about like what have we learned about the monarch from indigenous communities. The Day of the Dead, there's a lot of aspects of colonialism and the Spanish history intertwined oftentimes that needs to be unpacked. And so, I just want to emphasize that, the complexity of some of these narratives and also the multiple tribes that do exist in the area that have various stories and notions about the monarch.
I see one question, not monarch related, but are there any efforts to strengthen, reintroduce native pollinators beside the monarch? I feel like I could speak to a small segment of this, which is here at the Nature Center, we have acoustic monitors within our preserve that were installed by the Lincoln Park Zoo. And they help us do research on the bat populations here. So people often forget that bats are a pollinator. And so this research is helping shape the information we have about bat populations throughout Chicago. And specifically, the research showed us that we had 5 species of bats here at the preserve. So that is one tool that we can use to strengthen and reintroduce and continue to support pollinators. So thank you for that question, Jillian.
I saw a question from, I believe it's Cynthia, about the work of diversity and maybe memberships and asking groups to join. It's interesting because we talked a lot about justice. I'm going backwards. Justice, racial equity. There was a dabble of access and cultural relevancy and appropriation here and there. And diversity and inclusion work in particular sometimes get all lumped in. And so this idea of can we increase the diversity of our audience at a festival? Can we increase the diversity in membership? And so I guess the way I would go back and think about that is, you know, some of the conversations that we had about like our role as an institution and the role of the community. You know, definitely I would ask a little bit about that. What does your institution mean in terms of community, and what does the community mean in terms of the institution? And at the North Park Village Nature Center, we've explored that concept, you know, through time banking, for example. And so we really wanted to think about this notion of reciprocity. When I hear Joel talk about being in the community and really working collaboratively with the community, our Monarch Palooza hasn't you know quite reached you know that, but I would want to suggest some of that work internally. You know, what is how is your organization a member of the community? And we're asking about communities to become members of your organization. So I would ask that question back. And I hope that made sense, but those would be some steps and suggestions that I would have, besides kind of like adapting your value add, thinking about, you know, flexibility and access of membership. I would question a little bit more of that process internally.
Thank you, Maurice. Well, so we're going to wrap up the Q&A session and begin concluding our presentation. So I'm going to go back into screen sharing mode. So usually at this time of the presentation, we would maybe summarize or do a recap of what we had gone over. But as a group, we decided that we wanted to use the time left to uplift the organizations we mentioned in this presentation. So what I'll do is I'll copy the links to these organizations into the chat, and we hope you consider supporting their work. And I hope these come off as links. That does not look like links. Nope. Okay, we will make sure we follow up with appropriate links. I'll try one more time. Okay, we're going to follow up with appropriate links. This does mean a lot to us, and so I apologize for this little technical glitch. But we do want to, again, thank you for your time today. And so we'd like to leave this presentation, and we'd like to leave it and to send you off from this video just as the monarch butterfly in this clip is sent off. And we wish you all the best on your journey. And thank you for taking the time to be with us today.